Welcome, everyone. This is the March session of our Textiles of Japan Group 2. Today, we're going to be talking about Meisen, one type of ikat dyeing or kasuri dyeing. I'm going to start out describing what exactly the core definition of Meisen is. Then we'll review a few of the types of kasuri dyeing that we've covered in the past, and then I'll focus on the specific topic today. Okay, so let's get started with this. If we start out with a map of Japan showing the different regions, you might have a better concept of where to go hunting for these if you're prowling the streets of Japan looking for treasures. Okay, so here's the main map of Japan. This center point right here is where Tokyo is. And so you can see the primary Meisen producing areas are centered around Tokyo. Now, ikat itself, kasuri, is produced throughout the nation. Meisen is produced primarily in this region, and we're going to be talking about one variety in particular from Gunma Prefecture. So as you're familiar, of course, silk is made from silkworms, and here we have them in their grid work to produce the cocoon. First of all, the worms, having been raised to a certain point, ready to maturity, they're going to be scattered about in these little frames, a little bit like a dozen eggs or so placed in a carton. Okay, so they begin weaving their cocoon, and once that's done, those are allowed to mature to a certain point, which allows the silk itself to cure, popped out in a machine like this, and then we have the cocoons ready to go. Now, the cocoons themselves are not as necessarily quite as smooth or refined as some of the other types of silks you might find. I've stopped this for just a moment. One of the things about Meisen, and actually the meaning of Meisen, is the silk, not the dye technique. Okay, so Meisen is a tsumugi type silk, which means it has a slight slub to it, but it's a hard slub along the line of pongee. Okay, it's not a slub like a tussa or a raw silk. Okay, it's a hard silk like pongee is with a slub. And so once you have the silk spun and dyed, you go about the business of weaving it, and you wind up with this very utilitarian textile. It's rough and ready, wears well, lightweight, crisp, very comfortable. And as you can see in this case, simply stripes are being woven. There's no patterning in this all. There's nothing to hint at ikat. That is what Meisen actually is. Now, in conjunction with this type of weaving, stripes, as you see, are done, but quite a bit of figurative patterning is done also along the line of the kasuri dye work, the ikat dyeing. So I want to go over some of the basic types. There's shimikiri gasuri, okay, where you'll see in just a moment how the colors are applied. Now notice what she's doing here. She has two sticks, and let me see, I have a little close-up detail here. Okay, so right here, if perhaps you can see, these are two flat sticks. And at first glance, I thought maybe there were grooves carved in the stick, but that's not the case. String is wrapped around. And that makes actually more sense. So that this string wrapped around the stick is dipped into the dye pot and saturated. And then the yarn to be dyed is rubbed between the two, which is a very practical way of getting the dye in a very controlled manner into the yarn itself. Okay, now to plan that type of patterning, you're going to draw out a sketch as you would for any weaving design. This type tends to be fairly simple, most often warp, although sometimes there's a little bit of a weft patterning added. You can see the pot here as well and see it being rubbed. This gives you a great deal of control of exactly where the color is placed. Now, I'm going to back up just a minute here. Okay, so you can see in this case, this green line, the chevron. The chevron can be created not by dyeing one strand for each gradation in the shape, but if you take one solid bundle and dye all of those green at the same time, and then shift the warp once it's on the loom, you can get the chevron. And so that's exactly what this dyer is doing with the sticks in the yarn. She's applying the green, which will create that entire chevron. And there are great many threads in that bundle because there will be many chevrons throughout the pattern. Now, once those areas are dyed like that, they're going to go back and tie that off with a vinyl strip like this. I do sell the strips for this on my website in spools of it, but you can always make do with plastic grocery sacks in a pinch. Notice the one on the right has no tying. The one on the left has tying, the one we just tied off. They need to put both sets of skeins in the pot at the same time because they need to have the background colors identical. So they need the same amount of time in the pot. Once the blue is dyed, you can go back and pull off the vinyl, okay? And you can see that exposes the color below. And then, of course, you're ready to go about your dyeing. Okay. Here's that same warp on the loom. You can see the green chevrons in combination with the yellow chevrons. Now, this particular weaver will be adding a little bit of weft thread to the square area. So that was the one type of kasuri. This yokoso gasuri is yet another type. The first one we were dealing primarily with the warp. This one we're going to be dealing primarily with the weft. And so what you can see here is I've created a false loom, a little bit like those pot holder weavers perhaps you did in Scouts, where you take the little loops of fabric to weave a pot holder. So in this case, what I've done, just to illustrate this, is I've put some pegs along one side, pegs down the other side that are the width set to the width of my completed yardage. I've taken one weft thread and gone back and forth, pretending to weave, basically, then gone back and with ink drawn my design on this. This will be the prototype. So earlier, where we followed our graph to go ahead and create our patterning by tying off sections, in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out that single strand of weft. I'm going to use the black marks that I've put on my prototype and treat it a little bit like Morse code with dot, dot, dash, dash kind of thing. Wherever there, I'm going to take a whole bundle of thread, and wherever there's a black dot, I'm going to tie that section off and dye the rest of it. That way, as I pick apart the bundle, and one strand at a time, go back and weave the weft back into position, all of these dots and dashes should line up to create my original pattern. Okay, that's this type of kasuri dye. Okay, now the next type that we're going to talk about is this kukuri gasuri. Kukuru means to wrap around something, okay, to bind something. And that's what this craftsperson is doing here. He has a bundle of threads, and he's going along. These are weft threads. And he's going to go along and tie off each of these little pre-calculated sections, very minute patterning. That they don't have to always be minute, but the point is it's bound off with string, often in tiny little spots here and there to create very detailed patterning. So the pattern itself will be a series of white spots, and the background will be whatever dark color, perhaps indigo, perhaps a synthetic thread color. Okay, you can see what meticulous work this is. Now, this next one is a type of kasuri we have covered in the past, itajime gasuri. Itajime means to clamp between boards. And so perhaps you've heard that relative to shibori type work where you'll clamp two boards together called itajime. Same meaning, okay? In this case, what they've done is lined up all of their warp threads, and now they're going to sandwich it between layer after layer after layer of wood. each panel that you're seeing has had grooves carved into it. And there are sets of grooves that match up with each other so that wherever the yarn is pinched, it's pinched equally on both sides. The channels between will allow dye. Let me stop for just a minute. You can see the little grooves that are carved. And so once this is pinched, once it's clamped down very solidly, the yarn will be pinched between the raised section of wood, okay, just as this section, looks like it's not quite matching, but it's supposed to. This raised section will pinch the yarn, but this channel will allow the dye to run through, staining it. So here again, you'll wind up with a whole series of dots and dashes, the pinched part being resisted and the groove part being dyed. And so here again, you can see they lay it down over the board with grooves, and another board is laid on top until you get quite a huge stack. Now, once that's been dunked, let me back up here just a moment. Once that's been dunked, you can see all of the dots and dashes, which will then line up to create an exquisitely detailed pattern. Okay, now this next section is called Hogushi Kasuri, okay? And this is Hogusu means to remove something, to pick apart something, to untangle something, okay? So in this case, what we're going to start out doing is taking our loose warp threads away from the loom, similar to what you just saw with the clamp, but unlike the loose threads of the clamp, what we're going to do in this case is we're going to weave them very quickly and very loosely, back and forth, not tamping down at all, just very, very loose zigzag with an extremely fine weft thread. Once the entire bolt has been woven this way, it's taken off the loom, and then we're going to print. We're going to print with stencils. So here you can see there's a pattern of ginkgo leaves. Now this particular craftsperson is using a brush. So these are similar to the peony brushes I have on my website, but you can also use a squeegee just like in silk screening. That's as commonly used. The brush allows for shading, the squeegee doesn't. So once the stencil is pulled up, you see the thickened dye is attached to the warp threads. The warp threads are held in place by this very loose weft. That's why you have the weft. Go back and put as many stencils as you require for your design. The entire thing is steamed, and once it's steamed, it is put back on the loom as you pick off that very, very loose weft thread, the very thin thread. That's the hagusu part. That's what you're picking off. You're picking off that weft, which has helped to keep all of those warp threads very, very consistently in line to allow for accurate patterning. Okay, so this is everything stenciled now. We go about steaming it, put it back on the loom. And go about our weaving. Now, some of you might think of kasuri. You say, well, that's not kasuri. That's just silk screening, right? It's just silk screening before it's woven. But you have to understand that kasuri doesn't refer to the technique. Kasuri refers to the finished product. And the concept, the verb kasuru, kasteru, means to be blurred edged, okay, not sharp and crisp. So if I'm going to stop here for a moment, see how all of the edges, because there is slight movement of the threads as you work with them, no matter how carefully you silk screen, everything winds up just a little bit as if it had wicked, a little bit blurry around the edges. And so this very much does fit the Japanese definition of kasuri because the edges are blurry this way. So no matter how you get there, if you wind up with this look, it's kasuri. Now, the one I want to talk about today is this Heiyo Gasuri, okay? And this is done exactly the same way I just described. Heiyo Gasuri is done exactly the same we did a moment ago. The difference is far more stencils are normally used with this particular version of it, and a lot more trendy patterns are used. So you can imagine if you're sitting tying all of these off strand by strand, as you saw with the earlier gentleman tying off with thread, how very time consuming that is. So you want to deal with classic patterns. It's not a very quick turnaround. But this screening method, similar to silk screening, allows for a very quick turnaround, relatively speaking. Okay, still a lot of work, but it allows for a quick turnaround to allow your themes to be very topical or trendy. Okay, so as a result, we wound up with very much more contemporary looks, patterns that are influenced by the current fad, happenings in world governments and things like that. Um, just whatever's happening in the world that you want to express in your textiles the turnaround time is quick enough that you can have the pattern available to you while it's still trendy. Now, this was popular primarily at its peak, I'd say in the 1920s or so, all the way into the 30s. And still, of course, people will wear these, although they're not produced much anymore. But very beautiful, very exquisite detailing of pattern. You can see they're very contemporary, very modern looking. They don't really have so much of a traditional Japanese look to them. This one of roses is particularly beautiful. You saw the one of the castle just a moment ago. There are all sorts of patterns that are of the time. This one also is very modern of sunny side up eggs. Okay, bit cubist. It doesn't have to be complicated. And again, a very beautiful one following the traditional concept of undulating lines. So this is a contemporary fashion show showing off some of it. Okay, you can see how nicely her socks are matching the pattern at the top. So in a contemporary sense, people are trying to modernize these, trying to bring them back into contemporary society. And so that means combining them with Western clothes in a very jaunty sort of way. Okay, again, a poster back from the 1930s, 20s and 30s showing a woman wearing the ikat, the Meisen. Now, this one I put up by way of contrast. This is still ikat. It's still the weft ikat pictorial type, so we could call it egasuri if you like. But the reason I'm putting this up is this is not Meisen. Okay, Meisen is that hard, pongee-like slub. This one is a very soft, sort of unspun, fluffy filament, fluffy silk. It's also tsamugi, it's also raw silk, but it has a much softer, fluffier, gentler feel to it, not as crisp as the other. So even though the technique is identical, remember that we're really talking about the weave as much as we are the dye technique. It's very common to wear these as nenneko, which were the garments worn over a baby, the baby on the back. You can see what wonderful contemporary patterns there are, European patterns, all sorts of foreign influence. And now look at how beautiful this one. I don't know if you can see this on your screen, but this silhouette here actually has three colors in it. There's the gray, showing the detail work of the stonework. But there's also red, a maroon, and a black. And the silk screening allows for that kind, the silk screen, the stenciling, allows for that kind of layering and subtlety of color, which is very hard to get in other ikat techniques. And here you see the penguins and stuff. This was popular right at the time the South Pole was discovered. Obviously, the Disney characters are always very popular. These now are a couple of pieces. The last couple of pieces are from my collection. This one is telling you the label that came with it. It's telling you that it's silk, okay, that it is the thread kusuri patterns that were dyed by hand, woven by hand. And this particular person won an award for his skill at producing this piece. I like this because it does have the provenance with it, and it does have the finished piece framed. So this is one segment of a repeating pattern, which you'll see the type of kimono in a moment. But all of this detail work was done by this craftsperson. He won an award for his skill. That particular piece would have been used as you're seeing this haori. This entire panel is one repeat. And so this garment would have required one, two in the back, two in the front, three, four, five, six, six repeats with some left over at the bottom here. 6 repeats of this pattern, as opposed to other repeating patterns we might think of as being, dozens of times. There's no attempt to match the seams. That's just not part of the aesthetic whatsoever. Okay, and this gives you an idea of some of the detail work in it. Okay, so you can see the fuzzy lines along the side of the pillar. You can see the blending of the color. There's no attempt at outlining, but there are areas of color that define the shape. Just as you see the tree here, the foliage has 3 colors. The dark green, the light green, and the yellow is sufficient to give you a very good sense of the forestry about the temple. Okay, so those are the pieces that we've covered today. I thank you all for joining me. I'll go ahead and sign off now, and we can join as a group and talk about the pieces we saw and your questions, okay?